Adam Smith believed in an open and just society and in an open and just world order. He helped explicate how a decentralized market system would flourish and how nations could become wealthy. He explained also that individuals had a moral compass, and that they set their moral compass according to how an impartial spectator would view one's actions. He believed that empathy, or what he called sympathy, was an innate part of human beings. People cared about each other and wanted to be admired and respected by others. But today, the market system from which global prosperity has emerged over 2 centuries is now under attack from all sides. Its basic legitimacy is questioned from the left and also from the right. Adam Smith, through his writings, provided the initial explication of the benefits of an open liberal market system, but we now have to reassess and recalibrate based on where we are. We are here to take inspiration from Adam Smith as we endeavor to tackle very serious issues, which, in my view, are existential threats to a market-based, open, liberal order that he extolled 250 years ago. Some of those threats are internal to us. In fact, most of them are. And some of them are external. But these threats are interdependent. Both threats must be contained. Either one, in my view, can lead to economic and political disruption, possibly the demise of liberal democracies throughout the world. So what are these internal threats? They come from the manner in which, in my view, we are not tending to the requirements of a robust, caring society of the kind that Adam Smith himself extolled, in which the impartial spectator that I mentioned before is sufficiently present to cause us to pay attention to the plight of others. This risks the breakdown of the social contract. The impartial spectator is a fictional device created by Adam Smith to help us harness sympathy for the predicament of others. As Adam Smith said, everyone has this sympathy. I know everybody in the room does. But as Adam Smith pointed out, even the greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of the laws of society, is not altogether without it. The Enlightenment that he had so much to do with was based on reason, intellectual liberty, and personal freedom. But it also assumed and implicitly required the moral underpinnings that Smith outlined in the theory of the moral sentiments. And indeed, as most of you know, he insisted that his students read first the theory of the moral sentiments before they read The Wealth of Nations. And so even though the two books don't talk directly to each other, they do so indirectly, and he clearly saw them as two peas in a pod. Prior generations of ours generally assumed that self-sacrifice was called for, and it even made sense. If you served your organization or your family or your country, you'd be served back. US President John Kennedy suggested that we ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Many people responded, and the core of our civic society today still lives through this ideal. Now, serving others is sometimes considered a sucker's game, even though it clearly isn't. In the 19th century, de Tocqueville admired the number and variety of civic associations, many of them quite small, which he saw as vital to democracy. Today, both young and old feel detached sometimes disgusted by politics and the current dysfunction that exists in some of the institutions of public life. Many people have lost purpose. Church attendance has declined, community groups like the Lions Clubs are failing, many have lost faith in country. Individualism has given way to tribalism. Facebook and Instagram, technologies Adam Smith and de Tocqueville couldn't have imagined, have fractured communities by allowing people to engage in virtual relationships that displace in-person contact and reinforce narrow views. Let's talk a little bit about the market that Adam Smith so excellently extolled. Although many economists forget it, we know it's the ability to innovate that really is the hallmark of the market system and the driver of prosperity. It's not just exchange or trading that enabled prosperity, it's really innovation. That's how the West grew rich. If you read Smith carefully, he was onto this theme. As he points out, by means of the plow, 2 men assisted by 3 horses will cultivate more ground than 20 could do with a spade. But while Smith is not explicit about it, the clear message is that humans striving to save costs and make more profits stimulate innovation. Indeed, on closer inspection, it's apparent that Adam Smith's belief in free markets was based as much on dynamic efficiency as it was on allocative efficiency. With free markets, people can be creative and introduce novelty. This was one of the greatest insights of all time. But in today's world, our ability to sustain high rates of innovation is threatened by weaknesses at all levels of society, in families, in communities, in education, and in the corporation itself. The problems are amplified, in my view, by the manner in which capital markets today put pressure on the management of business firms for short-term financial performance. This guts the capacity of business firms to innovate. One wonders if the Boeing 737 MAX shortcuts were the result of a relentless focus on short-term profitability. The causes of short-termism run far deeper than issues related to the time horizon of managers. Issues of corporate governance and securities regulation are deeply implicated. These self-inflicted wounds are repairable, in my view. Although Adam Smith didn't provide a clear pathway, he did leave us signposts. It's time to re-examine how public policy and the individual actions of investment managers, executives, and government officials can be guided by moral principles, a deep awareness of one's place in society at large, and the geopolitical consequences of short-term profit pressure, undermining innovation, investment, and thereby a just society. Let's talk a little bit about external threats. Former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz recently noted, "We created a secure global economic commons which is now coming apart." The capitalist system of which Adam Smith remains one of the most celebrated observers is being challenged by China with a hybrid market economy. One of Western capitalism's strengths, its openness, is being used against it and its weaknesses exploited. The Economist notes that the World Trade Organization has not stopped nation states from flaunting the spirit, if not the letter, of the law of the WTO. So where do we go from here? How can we fix our own problems and create a new system of global governance? Well, this conference is designed to bring together thought leaders like yourselves and practitioners, of which there are some amongst us, in an effort to bust out of disciplinary boundaries by bringing knowledgeable experts together to explore today's challenges in a manner not dissimilar to the far-ranging approach used by Adam Smith himself and his circle of friends in Panmure House 250 years ago. Our two plenary speakers, like many of the attendees, are very broad, eclectic, and insightful. These efforts must aim, our collective efforts must aim to build national competitiveness for the long term by prioritizing innovation, strengthening the effectiveness of existing markets, creating new markets, and softening income distribution issues. Getting this right, in my view, will increase prosperity and generate the new resources that can be used to address complex global problems. The logo for our conference shows Adam Smith looking backwards and forwards. That design is deliberate, and hopefully that is the posture we can adopt here today. By design, we have both historians and futurists amongst us. We assemble here in Edinburgh to talk about very serious issues with respect to the global economy. I know of no other group that has been formed with our particular focus. Perhaps together, we can initiate the development of a plan of action to preserve democracy and advance the many innovative and beneficial elements of the private enterprise system. Let the conversation begin with John Kay, my good friend of many years, who has been one of the few economists who has looked deeply both into the functioning of the economic system and into the functioning of the business enterprise. And he is known not only for his multi-stakeholder view of the corporation, but of his many informed public policy recommendations. John, the platform is yours. Let me point out, of course, that John is also a Scotsman, as is Neil Ferguson and is Gordon Brown. So we're here to be led by the Scots to the new Enlightenment.
Thank you, David, and I'm not sure I can quite live up to that, but I'm sure we will do our best. As you all know, Adam Smith begins his great work with a description of a pin factory. There's some controversy over whether there ever was a pin factory or whether the great man actually visited it. I'll come back to that a bit later. But the economic historian, Sir John Clapham, chided Smith and said, instead of going to his silly pin factory, Smith ought to have got out more and visited the Carron Iron Works. The Carron Iron Works were 20 miles west of here. They were certainly real. That is what the Carron Iron Works looked like. And David Hume was certainly well aware of the Carron Iron Works. In 1772, with the wealth of nations in gestation, Hume wrote to Smith, the Carron Company is reeling. There had been this economic crisis in 1772, caused as economic crises so often are, by foolish and rapacious bankers. And as a result of that, Hume wrote, the Carron Company is reeling, which is one of the greatest calamities of the whole, as they gave employment to near 10,000 people. Do these events, he asked Smith, any wise affect your theory, or will it occasion the revisal of any of the chapters? The Carron Iron Works certainly didn't employ 10,000 people. It's possible, I suppose, that Hume was thinking about the supply chain, but I think Hume, great though his erudition was probably not a very strong empirical economist. Another rather more careful observer who actually went to the Carron Iron Works reckoned they employed about 1,200 people. and that they were then the largest industrial plant in Europe, which actually seems quite likely. And if they were the largest industrial plant in Europe, they were probably the largest industrial plant in the world at the time. The great Scottish poet of the time, Robert Burns, certainly did visit the Carron Iron Works. He didn't like it very much, and this is what he wrote. I think we've got yes. I've translated Burns out of the Llewellyn Scott, in which he wrote, in deference to our international audience, we come here to see your works, in hopes to be more wise, but only should we gang to hell, it would be no surprise. You will notice in this the implicit reference, as there actually is in a great deal of Burns' work, to predestination, the doctrine that we were destined from birth, either from heaven or hell, which formed a central part of Weber's argument as to why Scotland and other Protestant areas of Northern Europe played a central part in the evolution of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. But that's a set of issues which I think we will postpone for another day. Anyway, today we have moved far beyond the pin factory and the iron works. The Airbus 380 is one of the largest and most complex manufactured products of the present era. It's an extraordinary complex construction. Parts of it are built in different parts of Europe. The forward fuselage in France, the wings are built in Britain and Wales, the rear fuselage in Spain. The tail comes from Germany. The engines can come from either Rolls-Royce or BE. The landing gears made in England. And all of these things are taken in a wildly complex logistics operation for final assembly in Toulouse, at which point the completed fuselage is flown to Germany for final fitting out. It's an immensely complicated product, and there is no one, literally no one, no individual who knows how to build an Airbus. But 10,000 people taken together do know how to build an Airbus. That's the power of what has been achieved over these 2 centuries since Adam Smith, the power essentially of collective knowledge. And then with the aid of thousands of other people, that plane can fly for 17 hours. It can fly from Britain to Australia non-stop. It can do so, as I said, today. And Adam Smith wrote 10 years before even the first fleet set sail from England to Australia. That's where manufactured processes have developed in the 200 years since Adam Smith wrote about the pin factory. But the pin factory was a linear, repetitive process. As Smith described it, one man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, and so on. And every pin was intended to be like every other pin. The process of pin manufacture was linear and it was repetitive. And that was what manufacturing production was like in Smith's time and through the 19th and 20th centuries that followed. At the beginning of the 20th century, we had the idea of Taylorism, or scientific management, the idea that you could study every individual part of that process, time it, record it, stylize it, and then construct a scientific process on the basis of that. That saw the Ford assembly line, and of course the Ford assembly line was imitated even more successfully by what was to become the iconic manufacturing company of the 20th century, which was General Motors. And indeed, for people writing about business in the mid-20th and mid-late 20th century, business was, for practical purposes, General Motors. Peter Drucker wrote the first great modern management book, and it was about General Motors. Alfred Chandler founded effectively the modern subject of business history, and it was in large part about General Motors. Ronald Coase in the late 1930s defined the modern theory of the firm. He would win the Nobel Prize for that, followed in due course by Oliver Williamson elaborating Coase's theory into markets and hierarchies, and Coase's description of business in his Theory of the Firm article is a lightly disguised description of General Motors. Business was General Motors. The ultimate in the rationalist model of production, however, the linear, repetitive process, was actually not so much at General Motors in the late 20th century as at Ford, where the whiz kids, led by Tex Thornton and Robert McNamara, were recruited by Henry Ford Jr. to run the Ford Motor Company after the Second World War. McNamara notoriously would go on to become Kennedy's defense secretary and apply these kind of principles with great lack of success to the Vietnam War. Tex Thornton would leave and build Ling Temco Vought, which founded the modern conglomerate theory with the idea that there were management techniques that could be applied to any business, regardless of the product and regardless of the individuals in the corporation. The one piece which remained to be fitted into the rationalist framework was provided in a relatively popular way by Milton Friedman in his famous stroke notorious 1970 article, The Social Responsibility of Business is to Maximize Its Profits, and by Jensen and Meckling, who very few years later would write a description of the modern management problem as essentially a principal-agent problem in which shareholders, too busy and dispersed to actually run the business themselves, would hire the agent, the executives, to run the business for them. That's where we were in thinking about business towards the end of the 20th century. But actually, modern business is really very different from that. I want the second part of what I have to say today to look at that modern business and how it differs. And I want to begin, as is only fitting on these kind of occasions, to begin with a trailer for a new book which I've just completed with Mervyn King. The subject is Radical Uncertainty, and it will be published in the UK by Little Brown, in the US by Norton in March 2020. Having got that out of the way, let me tell you a little bit about what it's about. There was a distinction between risk and uncertainty, which people used to make. There was a great controversy in the 1920s about risk and uncertainty, in which Frank Knight talked about uncertainty as the driver of innovation and the source of profit, in which Keynes similarly attacked the logical foundations of classical probability. Interestingly, a lot of these foundations were developed precisely for the repetitive manufacturing processes which I've described. One of the founders of modern classical statistics was a man who wrote under the pseudonym Student. Those of you who've done any course in elementary statistics will be familiar, for example, with Student's T. We now know who Student was. He was an employee of the Guinness Brewery Company who worked for Guinness first in Ireland, improving brewing processes, and actually went on to become managing director of Guinness's first English operations in Park Lyle. Gossett was Student, and with other people like Neumann and Fisher, he developed classical statistics, and what Keynes was doing was attacking the logical foundations of that theory. But these classical statistical techniques which were applicable to these linear repetitive processes, essentially stationary processes in which the distinction between risk as it had been, which could be described probabilistically, and uncertainty which could not, was elided because in a stationary repetitive world, everything could be talked about probabilistically. And that was taken up in the 20th century by Motorola and finally and famously by General Electric, talking about Six Sigma. Six Sigma tolerating very low errors in repetitive manufacturing processes was relevant to GE's businesses in aero engines, its businesses in healthcare. It wasn't, however, very relevant to its businesses in financial services. And of course, that kind of thinking, the idea that uncertainty could be represented by known probability distributions because there were underlying stationary, unchanging, linear, repetitive processes, which was quite false in its application to financial services, was and is the basis of value at risk modeling, which is used with marked lack of success to control risk in the financial sector. GE, like other large manufacturing corporations, was struggling towards the end of the 20th century. But its struggles were concealed by the apparent success for 2 to 3 decades of its financial services activities, activities which, as we now know, would collapse in 2008, and the weaknesses of GE are today evident to us all. The decline of GE is part of the process of the end of that kind of rationalist story of manufacturing business, beginning a process that I regard at the end of the 20th century as the decline of the icons. GE and General Motors were the iconic manufacturing corporations of the 20th century. If I move over to Britain, even in the early 1990s, the 2 leading industrial companies in the UK were ICI, the chemical company, GEC, the electrical company. Today, neither of these companies exist anymore. I could go on. If I look at Britain's iconic non-manufacturing corporations, I point to Marks and Spencer, which in the 1990s decided to focus more on growing its earnings than on maintaining its almost extraordinary reputation in the retail sector. In 1998, it succeeded in achieving its highest ever profits of £1 billion. Following that, its profits fell off a cliff, and Marks and Spencer has never regained remotely that level of profitability ever since. I can go on with example after example of the decline of these great manufacturing and other corporations of the 20th century, and I've done that with barely mentioning the financial services sector, which is the most extreme of all. We've seen the collapse of these icons, and if I look back at the Fortune 500 list of 50 years ago, and look at the firms at the top of that list, I find 3 automobile companies, I find 3 steel companies, I find Armour Foods. I actually had to go and look up who Armour Foods actually are, or were, which is rather more to the point. And if I look at the top of that list today, the names I come up with, of course, are Microsoft, Google. I can find 3 manufacturing companies towards the top of the list. They're all rather odd manufacturing companies. They're Apple, they're Berkshire Hathaway, they're Johnson & Johnson, and of course all of them have the characteristic that manufacturing as such is a relatively small part of the total value added of these businesses. That is, the modern Western business world is one that has moved away from being characterized by these linear, repetitive manufacturing processes. It's a world, in the terms in which we describe it in our book, a world of radical uncertainty, in which we don't know, looking at the future, we don't know just the particular things that are going to happen, but there's a great deal of uncertainty even around the kind of things that are going to happen. So that's the challenge for us intellectually. The challenge for us to make what David calls a new Enlightenment, to find techniques and ways of thoughts that are relevant to this very different world of very different types of business, and together a very different kind of economy. The world in which these new economy companies are characteristic of modern business and the modern economy. What I want to do in the remains of my talk is to list some themes that I think are relevant to that kind of new Enlightenment thought. The first of these themes is the contrast between what I call axiomatic rationality and evolutionary rationality. Axiomatic rationality is about the kind of modes of thought that have been characteristic of economics through really all the second half of the 20th century, and indeed today. Axiomatic rationality is the idea that we ought to behave in accordance with certain simple behavioral axioms, the kind of economics that was formulated in the late 1930s, 1940s, and has been the basis of the analysis of economic rationality ever since. I want to contrast that with evolutionary rationality. What do I mean by that? Way back, going 2 centuries back again, Bishop Paley famously wrote about the man who discovered the watch on the heath. And the point of discovering the watch on the heath was you saw this and realized that it could only have been created by some intelligent designer. Paley argued that the world was so complex that in effect was itself proof of the existence of God, the existence of someone who had designed the totality. And of course, in the mid-19th century, Darwin and others would throw that argument back in his face by showing that actually evolutionary processes of adaptation could produce outcomes that were far more complex than any human design could actually conceive of. Applied to social institutions, that was actually an insight which had been formed at least a century earlier by those thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment. If David Hume and Smith are the names that are best known to us today, probably the third of these great names is Adam Ferguson. Adam Ferguson, David tried to persuade me that I ought to wear a kilt for the reception this evening. I explained to him that I was quite sure Adam Smith had never worn a kilt in his life, or indeed dreamt of wearing a kilt in his life. Adam Ferguson actually came from about 50, 60 miles north of here, from the edge of the Highland line. I ought to explain for those of you who are unfamiliar with Scotland that the Highland line divides the historically extremely poor, primitive, very beautiful Highlands of Scotland from the rather more boring and by Adam Smith's time increasingly industrialized south. Southern Scotland spoke Lowlands, as Burns did in the poem I cited earlier. Only north of the Highland line did anyone speak Gaelic. Adam Ferguson, unlike Smith and Hume, actually spoke Gaelic. Adam Ferguson was in fact for a time chaplain to the Black Watch. The Black Watch was a regiment raised after 1745 by the British government. It was a regiment raised by the British government from Highlanders to pacify and subdue the Highlands. And there's still some disagreement about whether the black in Black Watch refers to the hearts of the Highlanders who were willing to sign up for this venture, or to the plaid, the precursor of the modern kilt sold to American tourists. The plaid was the wrap of cloth thrown round the body, which was what these rather poor, primitive Highlanders wore in order to keep out the elements which are singularly unpleasant in much of the Scottish Highlands. So Ferguson was chaplain to the Black Watch. But actually Ferguson's most famous contribution was not anything to do with his military prowess, but to do with his essay on the history of civil society. Published in 1767, almost 10 years before Smith's Wealth of Nations. That's rather important because Smith and Ferguson fell out. And what Smith and Ferguson fell out over was the pin factory. Ferguson, in his essay on the history of civil society, has an extended description of a pin factory which looks remarkably like Smith's description of the pin factory, which begins The Wealth of Nations 10 years later. It may surprise you to know that it was Smith who accused Ferguson of plagiarism in all of this. Because Smith had given lectures before 1767 in which he referred to the pin factory. And Smith claimed that Ferguson had listened to these lectures or seen transcripts of them and used that in his essay on civil society. Ferguson made the rather devastating response to this that actually neither of them had been to a pin factory. And the whole story of the pin factory had been copied out of a French book which had been published in the early 1760s. I won't try to adjudicate on that particular controversy. I will, however, suggest that it might be better if economists got out more and actually did indeed visit some of the businesses about which they write. One who did, whom I know should be in the audience today but can't actually see, is Dick Rumelt, who wrote famously about going to interview Steve Jobs after Jobs went back to Apple in 1997, hoping to hear Jobs' vision for Apple and the evolution of the personal computer industry. And Jobs famously said to Rumelt, "I'm going to wait for the next big thing." That was Jobs' strategy for Apple in 1997. Of course, the next big thing actually turned out to be digital downloads of music, which led 4 years later to the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket, as Jobs described it. And of course, in due course, was reunited with the other big thing of that time, which was the development of social media, so that the combination of the music store with the apps created the smartphone, which every one of us today has in our pocket. This is an example, essentially, of evolutionary rationality, of the kind of rationality which exists when we don't know and can't know what it is the future holds, or even the types of things that the future will hold. It's a matter of understanding what the capabilities of the business are and adapting these capabilities effectively to the changing economic environment. That is the kind of thing which Ferguson had in mind in his essay, that essay on the history of civil society, in which he wrote, "Nations stumble upon establishments, which are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. That was Ferguson in 1767. That was the formulation, essentially, of this idea of evolutionary rationality in the development of institutions. And Ferguson was deeply skeptical about the idea that institutions were the product of individual design. We ascribe, he wrote, to a previous design what came to be known only by experience, what no human wisdom could foresee, and what, without the concurring humor and disposition of his age, no authority could enable an individual to execute. The prescience of that is obvious when we realize that was not actually true of the pin factory. It was perfectly possible for any individual to design a pin factory, or indeed a Carron Iron Works. The Carron Iron Works were based essentially on designs which the constructors of the Carron Iron Works had stolen from the Coalbrookdale Works in England at the time. That wasn't true of the pin factory or the Carron Iron Works. It wasn't even true of the rationalist models of production which I've been describing, but it was true in the context of the Airbus. So the first thing we need to understand in looking for ideas for this new Enlightenment is the importance of evolutionary rationality. The second thing I think we need to realize is to do with the economics of teams. Now, way back when I was a graduate student in the early 70s, Marshak and Radner wrote a book on the economics of teams. I thought and others thought that this was going to be a great theme in economics. Actually, it wasn't, because economics then went down the route which I've described earlier in terms of axiomatic rationality, in terms of the shareholder value ideas, the principal agent models that were central to that Chicagoan view of the world. Still, I came back to the idea of the economics of teams in some work I did in the early 1990s when I first became interested in business issues. I can move on to, this was for a few years one of the most used slides in my slide library, but I resurrected it for purposes of this conference. It's slightly requires a little bit of explanation, I think. What we did was we collected data for 20 years about the performance of English League football clubs relative to how much they had spent on players. So we had this large database that had how much clubs had spent on players' wages and transfer fees to buy players, and their performance over that 20-year period. And what you can see from that line is that, roughly speaking, what you see is what you get. The more you spend on players, the better the team performance. However, there were two large outliers for this. The first, if you look down the bottom left, is Nottingham Forest, which we believed was explained by what we called the Brian Clough effect. Those of you who are familiar with the history of English soccer will know that Brian Clough was one of the great controversial managers, and it turned out that every single club that Clough had managed was off the line in terms of performance. However, interestingly, despite the emphasis that clubs and team owners give to coaches and managers, there was no evidence that any other manager had any effect at all on the performance of teams, but Clough did. But the really interesting story is to go to the far right of the screen and see M at the bottom and LI at the top. Because the two top performing clubs in the league over that period had been Manchester United and Liverpool. And Manchester United and Liverpool had won almost the same number of league championships, the same number of overall wins, the same number of goals over the period, but Manchester United had spent far more on players than Liverpool had. With Manchester United, you got what you expected from what you'd spent on players. From Liverpool, with Liverpool, you got far more than you expected, given what they had spent on players. Liverpool, in short, functioned as a team. Manchester United did not. Manchester United was little more than the sum, the aggregate of the performance of the individual players. I then formulated a simple model of football, which I must say didn't endear me to my football supporting friends, which said if you're a footballer and you get the ball, there are two things you can do with it. You can kick it towards the goal, or you can pass it to someone who's better placed to kick it towards the goal than you are. And the strength of a team depends on how willing you are to pass it to a better placed player rather than to kick it towards the goal yourself. That as I say, my soccer playing friends didn't find that a very satisfactory description of the game they found so exciting. But I still find it, if not in that particular case, at least by analogy, a way of understanding what it is we mean by team. And of course, the exciting story, which everyone who knows anything about English soccer knows, is the performance in 2016 of Leicester City, which was a club which was entirely mediocre in terms of the players which it had hired and employed, but which won the Premier League Championship in 2016 at odds of 5,000 to 1 against at the beginning of the season. It also brings home the issue of what business strategists have called uncertain imitability, which is that not only could no other club imitate Leicester City's extraordinary team performance in that particular year, but even Leicester City could not imitate it itself, because the following year Leicester City's team performance fell apart, and Leicester has never come even close to replaying the form which it achieved in 2016. So we need to think about the product of teams. We achieve a team, the value of a team in business, by creating an organization which is worth more than the sum of its parts individually. That's what we mean by a team. That's what is achieved by this complex production process, which I described earlier in terms of Airbus. The third concept, which I want to emphasize, is factor heterogeneity and differential capabilities. Because that's what we're talking about when we talk about football teams. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the differential performance of different organizations doing the same thing. Factor heterogeneity leads us into the theory of economic rent, which of course is generally attributed to David Ricardo in the early 19th century. However, I can reveal today that Ricardo's theory of rent was actually almost completely anticipated by another Scottish Enlightenment figure, the name of James Anderson. He was a part-time gentleman farmer, part-time philosopher, part-time economist, who wrote, simultaneous with Adam Smith, an exposition of the differences between rent of land in eastern and western Scotland in terms which more or less exactly anticipate what Ricardo would write about 40 years later. And Ricardo explained in his 1817, I think it was, publication, how land varied from the best to the worst, how there was the margin of cultivation, the point at which it was just worth bringing land into production, and how the rent of land was essentially a linear function of the superiority of better land relative to to worse land. And of course, we can apply that kind of analysis to the differential performance of firms. We can range firms or football league clubs or anything else we want from best to worst in the same activity. The benchmark firm is the industrial equivalent of the margin of cultivation, and economic rent is what is earned by people, by firms who are inside that. That also introduces the very important concept in thinking about this of what I call competitive leverage, which is how does superior land quality or superior performance translate into superior economic return. You can have very dramatic competitive leverage. For example, the difference between an Olympic gold medalist runner and an average club runner is perhaps 5%, an amount which could not be detected by anyone, even quite an experienced observer, except with the aid of a stopwatch. But it is the difference between winning an Olympic gold medal and achieving absolutely nothing. So that profitability of an industry, an activity, whether it's football league clubs, whether it's business industry activity, so that pharmacology, for example, in which one is willing to pay quite a lot more for the best drug than the second best drug, is in these terms an industry with large competitive leverage. And of course, extreme competitive leverage leads to what people have identified as winner-takes-all markets. So this analysis of the determinants of rent and the nature of competitive leverage is, I think, fundamental to understanding these kinds of modern economic organizations. My fourth theme is the firm as a collection of capabilities, which links with the concept of competitive knowledge. We have collective knowledge, of course, in what has taken us from 1776, when people couldn't even think of flying, except a few years later with the aid of balloons, to 1903, when the Wright brothers first took to the air, to 2019, when we can build that Airbus. And we have that right across the board. If we stick with running for a moment, people have been running for thousands of years. We know that the Greeks even engaged in and valued competitive running. But actually, if you look at times for 100 meters, the Olympic gold medal of Harold Abrams, famously in the Chariots of Fire firm, won in 1924. He won in 10.6 seconds. 10.6 seconds wouldn't remotely qualify you for the Olympics anymore. The world record for the 100 meters is held by Usain Bolt, who can run it in 9.58 seconds. The first Olympic marathon was won in just under 3 hours in 1896. Today, the fastest marathon ever run is 2 hours and 20 seconds, and people are currently betting on whether the first sub-2-hour marathon will actually be run this year or next. That's a pretty dramatic improvement in this rather elderly sport over 100 of years. And what have done it? Two things. One is what I describe as collective knowledge. That's the accumulation of knowledge about training, about sports psychology and physiology, about nutrition and diet, about pacing yourself over a 2 or 3 hour marathon, which is accumulated over that past century. And the second is the widening of the talent pool, which is available for these kind of activities. So if you go back to that 1924 Chariots of Fire film, you will see that all the competitors in that 100 meters and other short distance race were white men educated at leading universities in Britain and the United States. whereas the people who are winning these marathons and 100-meter sprints now are actually very different. In fact, interestingly and significantly, the people who win the very long-distance races are typically people who are genetically East African, and the people who win the sprints are people who are genetically West African. And it's rather interesting to understand why that's happened. But let's simply note that globalization has affected running just as globalization has affected absolutely everything else. The widening of the talent pool. Remember, Adam Smith wrote that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, and that applies to every kind of human activity. So this combination of broadening the market and accumulating collective knowledge has led to this staggering degree of productivity improvement, even in old established activities like running. And collective knowledge, of course, is encapsulated in what has become a fashionable phrase in the last decade, the wisdom of crowds. But I think it's quite important to say that the wisdom of crowds is not actually the average of what is known by large crowds of people, which is what it is represented by in something like the book by Ceruvecchi, or in people who apply that kind of analysis to the wisdom of financial markets. The wisdom of crowds is actually the aggregate of our knowledge. It's not the average of our knowledge. And like most people, I prefer to fly in planes that are flown by trained pilots rather than planes that respond to the average wishes of the passengers who are on board that planes. It's the accumulation of aggregate knowledge which has made successful flight possible. I'd like to say a little as well about rent sharing in teams. Because of course, once you have teams creating surpluses, you need to share out the produce of that surplus. And that's of course one of the oldest problems in human history. It's a problem that was faced when the hunters of a tribe successfully managed to find some game and kill it. And then they were faced with the problem of assuming that the game was, the production, the activity of hunting was in aggregate value adding. That is, by hunting in a team, people were able to produce game more valuable than each could produce hunting on his own. How did you share the surplus between the two? And of course, the answer was then established by a combination of social norms and hierarchies, as it is today. That it's social norms and hierarchies that are behind the ways in which the surplus, the value added of teams, is shared. And that could lead me into my final heading, which is corporate governance. I could write a long essay on the implications of what I've had to say for corporate governance. And on future occasions, but not on this occasion, I will do so. I simply want to leave for the moment the observation that it's made very clearly by an interesting book by Richard Wrangham, published recently on primatologists, about the alpha male in primatology, because he explains as aggressive apes have discovered, and as, say, Louis XVI discovered, that if people use the hierarchy to accumulate all the surplus of the team for themselves, in general, the team responds by choosing a rather different hierarchical structure. And that has implications, I think, for the way we think about corporate governance and the way we think about industrial organization today. Everything I've said in each of these headings, I hope leads us to think in a rather different way about the economic organizations of the 21st century than the ways in which we've been used to thinking about them in the 20th century. We need to understand that the corporation is a social organization. which is a product of the society in which it operates, and which responds to the values of the society in which it organizes, in which it operates. It's a world in which we need to think about organizations in terms that draw at least as much on psychology and anthropology as they do on models of individual rationality. It's a way of thinking that has the tools that enables us to understand the complex organizations which are the teams that dominate modern economic organizations. Oddly, these are insights which were obvious to the scholars of the First Enlightenment. They were obvious to the scholars of the First Enlightenment, even though the much simpler production processes of the pin factory and the Carron Iron Works responded much better to this kind of analytic, that traditional kind of analytics, than do the organizations that dominate the economy today. But if these kind of insights were obvious to these First Enlightenment scholars, I think they ought also to be obvious to us today. Thank you. Now we are going to move over to have a panel discussion of some of the issues raised in what I've had to say and what David's had to say and what will be part of this conference. So if I can invite onto the panel Barry Eichengreen, economic historian, Matthew Slaughter, business school dean, and Lady Lynn Forrester de Rothschild of Enlightened Capitalism. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to make a short introductory statement, and then I hope we can have a discussion first among ourselves and then engaging the audience as we move forward. Barry?
Thank you, John. It is a pleasure, a somewhat intimidating one, to have this opportunity to comment on John Kay's remarks. A pleasure because they are John's. He sent us a longer and even richer version to ruminate upon on the plane over. Intimidating because of the venue where all economists are intellectual children of Adam Smith and of the Scottish Enlightenment, but some more than others. So I myself discovered economics about 30 miles north of here at the University of St. Andrews. So I have a intellectual debt to Scotland and its development of economic thought. The theory of the 21st century corporation that I heard John describe in the last part of his remarks focused on 5 characteristics. Number one, the 21st century corporation is a collection of workers with differential capabilities, meaning that its different employees have different skills that are not easily substituted for one another. Number two, the 21st century corporation is characterized by teamwork, meaning that decisions are taken and tasks are executed by groups or collections of employees. Number three, the 21st century corporation is a repository of collective knowledge, which is generated by these individuals with different capabilities through their participation in teams. Number four, the 21st century corporation is a repository, which is a repository of this collective knowledge is subject to increasing returns or synergies. And number five, the 21st century corporation is the result of evolutionary rationality, which means that technology and organization evolve in ways that reflect no one's conscious decisions, but rather what John calls adaptive capabilities. This view then is advanced as an alternative to 3 rather more conventional theories of the firm, where these are First, neoclassical theory, which sees the firm as a legal entity set up to solve a linear programming problem, just like any other linear programming problem. Number two, transactions costs theory, which sees the firm as an entity to execute functions that are too difficult to complete at arm's length due to asset specificity and asymmetric information. Number three, as an alternative to agency theory, which sees the firm and its governance as a solution, however imperfect, to the principal agent problem facing managers and shareholders. So, given that I am a student of Richard Nelson and Sidney Winter, I will call this the evolutionary theory of the firm, because I think it bears a considerable resemblance to that. A first question I want to ask then is, how many of these characteristics are distinctive to the 21st century corporation? That is John's subject. Nelson and Winter, who similarly emphasized rules of thumb, as well as outcomes that did not reflect anyone's conscious design, were writing in the 1960s and 1970s in response to the industrial dynamics, really, of the first half of the 20th century. And I think another one of my teachers, Alfred Chandler, who was writing about the late 19th as well as the 20th century business enterprise, had a lot of the same things in mind as well. So let me read you an extended excerpt from one of Chandler's articles. Now I'm quoting. Organizational capabilities provided the dynamic for the continuing growth of such firms. Chandler was talking about late 19th and early 20th century industrial firms. They were created during the knowledge acquiring processes. These capabilities resulted from solving problems of scaling up, the process of production, from acquiring knowledge of the customer's needs and altering product and process to service needs, coming to know the availabilities of supplies and the reliability of suppliers, and in becoming knowledgeable in the ways of recruiting and training workers and managers. Such knowledge and skills were developed by learning through trial and error, feedback, and evaluation. Thus, the skills of individuals depend on the organizational setting in which they were developed and used. Such learned skills and knowledge were company-specific and industry-specific. They were not, of course, patentable. They were difficult to transfer from one industry to another, or even from one company to another, precisely because they had been learned within a very specific organizational context. End quote. So if John is describing the 21st century corporation, I would argue he is also describing the late 19th century corporation and the 20th century corporation. Indeed, I would argue that one sees many of these same features: workers with different capabilities, teamwork, collective knowledge, evolutionary rationality in industrial shops, the very small manufactories that dominated wide swaths of what we would now call the manufacturing sector toward the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So I think I would characterize the Cairn Ironworks in somewhat different terms than John did in his talk. Maybe the difference between the 21st century corporation and these historical antecedents lies not in form but extent. Maybe the range or variety of capabilities is greater today. Maybe teamwork is even more prevalent today. Maybe collective knowledge is even more important today. Maybe synergies are greater today. I'm not sure. What could John add? What could he emphasize more? In my last couple of minutes, let me touch on 3 or 4 points. One connects to John's point on the economics of teams, which is the importance of physical proximity. So John started, of course, with the example of the Cairn Iron Works, a collection of arguably 1,200 workers assembled in one place. That example is then carried through Henry Ford's River Rouge plant and General Motors' assembly factories. In these cases, physical proximity has a lot to do with fixed capital and the costs of handling materials. But what about the Googleplex in Mountain View? Why do so many of Google's employees work in one place? Employees presumably work in close proximity to one another because this is integral to the operation of teams. A team seems to be more productive with face-to-face interaction. I make more progress on my research when I'm in the same room with my co-authors than when corresponding by email. We hopefully make more intellectual progress on our questions when assembled at the Balmoral Hotel than corresponding messaging one another from our home offices. There's a website called Pioneer that is currently sponsoring research intended to determine why video conferencing is such an imperfect substitute for these face-to-face interactions. I don't think we know the answer. The association of physical proximity and face-to-face contact with the efficiency of teams may have something to do with the importance of nonverbal communication. It may have something to do with how physical presence affects concentration and attention span. Whatever the answer, I think it's central to the theory of the firm, insofar as the firm, like the university, is more than a collection of people working from home. Second, and quite at odds with the previous point, is the rise of the gig economy, about which we didn't hear anything in John's presentation. A growing number of tasks that once had to be coordinated within the firm can now be reliably outsourced or subcontracted as a result of advances in information technology. So Google itself now has more temps, vendors, and contractors than it does full-time employees, and it uses them not just to operate its shuttle buses, but to write code, deal with sales, staff recruitment, even the management of its production development teams. It uses information technology to screen these individuals, monitor their productivity, adjust their terms of employment so as to match supply and demand to the point where, as I said before, they now outnumber Google's permanent employees. I think this too is changing the fundamental nature of work and the nature of the firm. Third, the importance of the platform economy. Insofar as the firm's collective knowledge and organizational capability are acquired through interaction with customers, suppliers, and coworkers, all of which appears in the work, again, of Chandler. The rise of platforms is adding something to that. It's transforming both the scale and the scope of those interactions. So if you market your product through Amazon Marketplace, the price of doing business is sharing the most intimate information about that product, but also about your customers. So platforms today control not only the terms of competition, often in ways that are opaque to outsiders, but they also have comprehensive knowledge of the market, enabling them to compete on advantageous terms with their own customers. I'm not sure we've seen anything like this, where a firm creates not only its product and the market for it. Chandler would have recognized that part, but it also controls the marketplace itself and generates and monopolizes the information on the basis of which that market works. Finally, politics and regulation. I'm out of time, so I will simply close with the observation that the political implications and the regulatory questions surrounding all of the aforementioned are profound. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Lynn.
Thank Thank you, John, and thank you, David, and everyone who conceived of this conference. It's been a real pleasure for me to go back to the 18th century and get out of the 21st century to think about things. And what I want to put into the idea of the conference is that what is the problem that we're solving for? That neoliberalism has in many ways hijacked Adam Smith as their patron saint. That was until St. Milton Friedman completely took it over. But what we know is that our system has created horrible problems of wealth inequality, and nowhere worse than, or few places worse, certainly in the G7, nowhere worse than in the United States, where the top 1% controls 42% of the national wealth, and the bottom 90% controls 4.7%. We have wage stagnation. We have dislocation of jobs and loss of jobs from globalizations, and just the economic security from technology. These are all problems that we're well aware of, and our problem is that our societies are well aware of them, and our societies are acting out against the framework that we have developed. For lack of a better term, we can call it neoliberalism. And I think that is an enormous problem that demands, in fact, the new Enlightenment. And it demands not just tinkering at the edges. And what I'm thinking about is that in 1945, when we thought that the world was being pretty well shaped, and we had Keynesian economics, and we had government and business, working together. General Motors, what's good for General Motors is good for America. We had all that going on in our society. It would have been, and it was in fact, a pretty loony idea to think about less regulation, less government, individual competition, the basic tenet of the reason for a corporation is to make profit for its shareholders. That was not the way people thought in 1945. But in 1947, a group of people who did think like that, led by Hayek, went to Mount Pelerin. It's not quite as nice as Edinburgh, but not a bad place in Switzerland, and got together and created a society around these new, relatively at that time, flaky ideas. And what I would like to call for is a new Pelerin society. Maybe it's the Penmore House Society. But that we can't tinker around with trying to fit round pegs of either government policy or corporate behavior into a square hole of an intellectual framework that isn't working for people. And that's the challenge that I think is before us. And I actually think that a lot of what John said begins to get us there. First of all, the idea of evolutionary rationality is the basis for thinking we have to change our intellectual framework, the one that adapts to the challenges of our society, and not just try to, like I say, tinker at the edges. And John's idea of collective knowledge and teams is also something that's very relevant, I think, to a new way that we can think about the basis. John made a decision to leave Weber and the sort of moral basis for all of this out, but I can't help thinking that in 1945, when Robert Wood Johnson created Johnson & Johnson, and he created a credo that said that his first obligation was to his customers, and his second obligation was to the great employees who created the great products for the customers, and his third obligation was to the community, and his fourth was to give a reasonable return to shareholders, that actually that was based, if not on religion, it was based on the impartial spectator. It was based on a concept of what we admire in society. So I think as we think about new tools for better corporate governance or new policies for redistributing or rebalancing the benefits from capital to labor, that we would be better off if we could put that in the context of some poetry. We have to have what Bobby Kennedy called moral imagination. And one reason I think we have the problems that we have is not because we don't know the solutions, but it's because people don't believe that we are actually in this together. I work on something called inclusive capitalism. And I think everything that we do in policy and in business should be toward making capitalism inclusive. Inclusive capitalism would have been a redundancy to Adam Smith. It is an oxymoron to everyone in the world today. And if we don't fix that, and fix it at a very fundamental basis where we have philosophers and poets and musicians thinking about how we truly convert our greed is good individualism. Because look at what happened from Mount Mepeller, and they were crazy ideas. By 1980, we had Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and greed is good was indeed the coin of the realm, because we didn't really think, I don't think we really thought of it as greed, but we didn't think of who we were leaving behind. So my call, in fact, in your invitation, David, you asked, where can we take this from here? I would like 39 people to get together, well-funded by some very good foundations, to begin a process of creating, I call it almost the poetry of bringing our society together through having an economy that works for everyone. And I think that will lead to a reform of our capital markets, but our capital markets need to be put in a new context that is built on different premises and creates new opportunities and new approaches to policy. So that would be my hope for what all of us in this room can think about in whatever seat we sit in, wherever we are, and possibly collectively. And to John, I would like to hear, in addition to your eight columns, or your 8 issues of a new way to look forward, I would like to hear from you about the theory of moral sentiments, about your thinking about how we can get to a societally acceptable and embraced moral consciousness about the change in markets and how we create more inclusive and sustainable societies through creating more inclusive economies.
Thank you, Lynn. Let me now turn to Matthew.
Sure, thank you, Lynn. And David, thank you for the invitation and bringing us all together here, and John for starting the conversation with your cogent remarks. I'm gonna offer one idea, and it is, I think I'm gonna offer it as perhaps sort of a meta theme on the terrific list that John, you provided us in thinking about what if we take up the charge of Adam Smith and David Hume in this 21st century for what we should be analyzing, I'm going to suggest everyone in this room, I'll come back to Lynn's poetry insight in a second, that it would be greatly valuable if we all spent more time thinking about talent, and especially the scalability of talent. That I think is unprecedented in human history that we find ourselves in this early part of the 21st century, and is driving a lot of the economic and business and social forces that brought us here together. So let me start with an example of a particular labor market. I'm an economist by training. I'm one of the few Paul Krugman students. So yes, we need to get out more in the world. So let's fix ideas with a particular labor market it's a US labor market. And if I showed us inflation-adjusted earnings in this labor market, starting after World War II, from 45 into the 50s, 60s, 70s, the mean earnings in this labor market, it's a high-talent labor market, was pretty constant. In today's dollars, at about $100,000 a year was the average earnings of one of those individuals. And then, like a lot of other things we've seen, all of a sudden the average earnings in this labor market as the 80s comes along goes up and up and up. And today it's up by about an order of magnitude. So the individuals in this labor market today earn an average earnings of slightly over $1 million US. Now, what labor market do we think this is? I think a lot of us, we might kind of think, we'd be like, okay, it's got to be investment bankers, it's got to be partners in law firms, it's management consultants. So those are all good guesses, and it's in the same ballpark, but it's wrong. And in the spirit of Barry talking about St. Andrews, I'm an avid but mediocre golfer. It's golfers on the PGA Tour in the United States. So we all kind of chuckle, but there's a lot of economics, I think, to unbundle here about talent. So what's been going on in the PGA Tour and a lot of other professional sports tours is the scalability of talent that's unprecedented in human history. And the three forces that drive that John talked about, and I think we'll be talking about a lot in the couple of days here, is a combination of globalization, technological change, and changing social norms. So what happened in the PGA Tour is playing and observing golf is kind of a luxury good in the lexicon of microeconomics. And as China and India have acceded into the global economy, the interest of billions of people on the planet to see what's happening with really good golfers has gone up a lot. Technology, suddenly then we have, with information technology that we all have in our pockets these days, the ability to follow these individuals has gone up dramatically. So you go from having kind of local labor markets in the time of Smith and Hume to suddenly the scalability of that talent. People can observe what's happening. And also the quality of play in some sense has gone up. When you look at, you're able to draw on individuals from all around the planet who might have an aptitude and ability to learn how to play golf. And so what's happened when you look at, it's the mean earnings have gone up dramatically. John talked about teams. Now golfers, it used to be kind of the social norms it was kind of you were a journeyman, you had your caddy. At the end of the day, you'd head to the pub and you'd have a couple of pops after the round of golf with reporters and things like this. Now what happens, because the immense returns to being in this high talent labor market, is there's been actually, on a lot of measures, a collapse in the distribution of talent, because you can't afford to be a marginal golfer now. So everyone now has their teams, and after the round, they'll go talk to their psychologist and their physio, and they'll go back to the driving range, and they'll hit balls again, and this, so on and so forth. And what's happened in particular, I gave us a data on the mean earnings. At the upper tail of the distribution, there's been an explosion of earnings that in some sense are unprecedented. So I've been in St. Andrews not to study, but to play golf a lot of times and lose a lot of golf balls in the heather and gorse. But in the spirit of where we are, let's look at Rory McIlroy. So Rory McIlroy is 30 years old. He's been a professional golfer for about 12 years, since he was 18. How much do you think Rory McIlroy has earned in playing golf on kind of tournament earnings in those 12 years? So if you said $47,923,848, that's right. He's 11th all-time on the golf earnings tour list. And what's remarkable is there's a couple people above him. A gentleman named Matt Kuchar has won about $50 million. Matt Kuchar is kind of this journeyman golfer. He's good enough to be in the PGA Tour. He's never won a major tournament, but he's just kind of by being talented enough to be in this massively scaled labor market. The marginal returns, the marginal revenue product of the lexicon of economics of a Matt Kuchar is unbelievable compared to what it was a handful of decades ago. What's most amazing about Rory is not just what he earns on the tour, it's what he earns in his endorsements. So 2 years ago, Rory McIlroy, this is all in the public domain, kind of because of his successes, signed contracts with Nike and with one of the club products producers, TaylorMade. It's a 10-year deal with Nike that's $250 million. And with TaylorMade, it's $100 million to wear their logos and swing TaylorMade golf clubs and so on and so forth. So that's $350 million just for kind of existing and playing golf above and beyond what he actually does on days of the tournament. And what's remarkable is relative to the metrics that I think a lot of what Smith and others talked about output, on observable metrics of strokes per round, number of major championships, Rory's an amazing golfer compared to mortals like me, but he's not better than the Jack Nicklauses and the Gary Players and the Arnold Palmers of a few decades before when the average earnings was flat. Rory's won 4 major tournaments to date. He hasn't won a career Grand Slam. He hasn't been able to win the Masters. Jack Nicklaus won 18 major tournaments over his career. And what's remarkable is Jack Nicklaus came in second place 19 times. So I use this as an example, but just to kind of, John, do you want to say something?
No, right. I'm just watching the time with some
my
trepidation.
point is, we can then think about what has happened, not just on the PGA Tour, but with bankers, with consultants, with just high talent individuals, even academics more generally. Lynn touched upon this, but we all know, I think the social context in which we find ourselves is we have massive rises in income inequality and wealth inequality and a sense of fading hope and opportunity in a lot of the countries in which we live and work. And we could go through the statistics, but Lynn summarized those. So I think what would be, I think, a research agenda for a lot of us, whether it's a group in a certain place or otherwise, is thinking about 3 dimensions of talent. One is, how do we create talent in the 21st century? And what does talent talk about? So John, one of the first things you talked about was the notion of rationality, but there's, I think, questions about what does it mean to be a flexible, adaptive individual in today's world where the predictability of how economies work is quite different. The second is, what is the market deployment of talent within and across organizations? I think it's very different. Barry talked about Google and some of the kind of emerging technology companies. The nature of teamwork and talent in those firms and how it's organized is quite different from what a lot of pin factories or Cairn Ironworks and things were like, and I think that's very salient. And then the third question I ask is, that we should all think about is, what should be the public policy response to how talent gets deployed? And here it gets to deep ethical issues. I think there's the poetry that Lynn talked about, but also provide, I think, just the prose of kind of more prosaic questions of what's a just marginal income tax rate to pay for things in our societies and things like that. So my home country, the United States, right now is very riven with discussions of, should the top marginal income tax rates be 70% or what should it be? And you know, we think about Rory as an example. The scalability of his talent in the marketplace, it's not a judgment against Rory. He's as good as Arnold Palmer and Gary Player were, but he's not like 1 or 2 orders of magnitude better in terms of how he swings a golf club. But it's the global accession of China and India, it's the creation of the internet, all those things are what raised his marginal revenue product. But he personally didn't do anything to create that. When you think about sort of claims of distributive justice, I think there's some interesting questions that we could all be thinking about. So I'll just close. I just have a couple quotes here actually from Adam Smith to honor the lovely theme of this conference. Many of the thinkers that we've talked about and that John and Barry and Lynn so eloquently talked about, they knew these issues were salient. I just think they're a lot more salient when we think about the scalability of talent than they used to be. So in The Wealth of Nations, one of the quotes from Adam Smith on the issue of inequality, he said, quote, "What improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconveniency to the whole. No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of its members are poor and miserable." And Lynn definitely touched upon that theme. And then the question of justice, and here I'm thinking about distributive justice in the context of how do we create and deploy and adjust for the vagaries of how talent works in our 21st century. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith had a quote about justice, which I think was a little sobering, but I think inspiring for all of us as an optimist. He said, quote, "If justice is removed, that great and immense fabric of human society, then our society must in a moment crumble into atoms." So if we don't have a sense of justice in terms of how our economic system works, especially, as I've said here, around how talent is created and deployed, the outcomes, we're living with the pressures in a lot of our societies with Brexit and so forth, but I think the scholarship that brings us all together here for the first couple of days can provide a lot of optimism and progress. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. We're running out of time, and I just want to take a moment or two to pick up some issues that I would like to respond to that have been raised by our panel. Firstly, let me respond in part to Barry by saying that I think Barry is quite right to have observed that Chandler picks up quite a number of the themes which I described when I talked about the 21st century corporation versus the 20th. Equally, I think if I go back, and I was very struck recently rereading Drucker's book about General Motors in the 1930s and 1940s. In Drucker's book, what Chandler and others, and Barry has said, is true, but it's true about the executive team. What is a striking theme of that book is the extent to which there is an assumption of gulf between the executive team, who are assumed to have some kind of intellectual role, and the labor force, which is treated as a commodity. And indeed, it was Drucker's prescient sense that that distinction might not last. There was really a large part of the disagreement between Drucker and General Motors, which led General Motors to to completely disregard Drucker's book and his observations. Secondly, Barry raised a very large group of points which are important about the central role of platforms, the gig economy, and physical proximity, etc., in this 21st century economy. And Niall Ferguson tomorrow will talk to us. I don't know what he's going to talk to us about, but he's recently written about networks versus hierarchies. And I think that networks versus hierarchies taxonomy is much more helpful to us than the markets versus hierarchies taxonomy. That is, the market economies today function essentially through networks. And that's behind what is going on in the physical proximity. It is also how there are really relatively few genuine anonymous transactions. And the gig economy and the platform economy are really mechanisms which are designed to make transactions between distant agents possible by removing or responding to the anonymity which is posed. It's brought home to one if you look at a poster in London Transport today that says, if you don't book your minicab, you're just getting into someone else's car. And it's the removal of anonymity, which is essentially the contribution of the intermediary in that. I'd like to respond slightly to Lynn with a story which she talked correctly about the Johnson & Johnson credo. And of course, the famous illustration of the power of the Johnson & Johnson credo was the story of Tylenol, where some crazy guy poisoned Tylenol, and Johnson & Johnson impressively, with people working from the lowest level of the organization up, removed Tylenol from the shelves of US drugstores within a few hours. The contrast to that is the story which some of you may know currently of Arkansas teachers and others versus Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs, like Johnson & Johnson with its credo, has a statement of business principles and of business ethics, which begins with our client's interests. We always put our client's interest first. Goldman Sachs are being sued by Arkansas teachers and others in this class action. These investors claim they were induced to buy Goldman Sachs stock in the belief that it was a reputable company bound by this code of business ethics. Goldman Sachs' defenses to this charge are not that the statement is true. Indeed, Goldman has itself produced 36 instances of newspaper reports which appear to describe conflicts of interest within Goldman Sachs. Their argument is that given that these statements and elaborate event studies show that it had no effect on the stock price, the revelation of conflict of interest, such statements of ethics have no effect on stock price, and Arkansas teachers could have suffered no loss. The second strand of argument is that statements of this kind are an inactionable puff in terms of American laws, akin to Red Bull gives you wings, or Heineken refreshes the parts other beers cannot reach, and therefore there is no cause of action. I don't think I need to elaborate the story much further. So I'll simply end with another story.
What was the end of the case? Who won?
The case is still continuing. It is currently on appeal to the Second Federal Circuit after an unfavorable decision in the Southern District of New York. So we await the decision of the US courts. I should say that since the courts has already decided that a statement by J.P. Morgan that we have elaborate and effective risk management procedures in place was an inactionable puff, I'm not very hopeful that Arkansas teachers will actually prevail in the end. I'll tell a final story to end with, to continue the sporting theme, which is actually quite useful because so many of the issues which we want to talk about business are illustrated in rather stylized form in the sporting cases. Many people still think that Stanley Matthews was the greatest English soccer player ever. I came across a report of a letter which Matthews received from the Football Association after Matthews had scored 2 goals in what was a critical match in which football was resumed after the Second World War, and England defeated Scotland at Hampden Park by 4 goals to 2. And the letter said, "Dear Matthews, we enclose a cheque for your match fee and your second-class rail fare from Stoke to Glasgow, 19 and 6pence. However, we regret to inform you that the 6pence expenditure on a cup of tea as you change trains at Carlisle station is not refundable by the Football Association, and you will yourself have to bear this expense." What has changed? Several things. One is issues of class structure and labor force. I'm inclined to believe that the officials of the Football Association probably didn't travel second class to Glasgow for the match. But most of all, that the cartel of owners to repress workers has since disappeared. And secondly, that the globalization has made the broadcasting of soccer and television rights to it enormously internationally productive, with much of the rents generated by this accruing to the individuals involved. There are 2 lessons. One is that social structures are critical to determining the distribution of rents in the modern economy, and that's the kind of thinking we need to answer some of Lynn's points. And the second is that globalization affects absolutely everything. It's even relevant to the cups of tea at Carlisle station. Thank you all. I think we now have a logistics message. David.
I'd like to thank the panel very much. This conference is going to be one where we learn various bits of useful information, and we're challenged, as Adam Smith was, to combine it all. So by the end, I trust you will have a fully articulated view of how our economy and society must move forward. In the meantime, we're picking it up bit by bit.